Suguli, Swagwake, hello everybody. Igere Daidwadalana. I'd like to introduce myself to all of you. Dehangunguta Niyungets Ne Ungwehne. My Oneida name is Dehangungut. It means that there's two paths that I'm going through. Gesklibagi Nimagitalot. The clan that I belong to is from the Bear clan. Evangeline Wila Ingwaslasakwa. She's my grandma, my mother's mother. We're matrilineal, so when we introduce ourselves, we always go to our mother's side. Onayodi Aga, Nebogadu Hunjot. And I'm from the Oneida Nation, commonly known as the people, the Standing Stone, Elukawan, Edwaknage. The other longhouse communities out east refer to our community as the place where there's a bountiful amount of waterfall we call Duck Creek. So I'm here today to talk a bit about our history and how that has impacted our people to where we are today. We're originally from New York. That's our homeland, just east of Syracuse. There's about 6 million acres of land out there that was identified as our homelands. It stretched down into Pennsylvania as well, and as well as up into Canada. Through treaties, we lost our land out there. And in the 1820s, there was a push to move our people out west, what was known as the Five Nations. They call this as the Iroquois Confederacy. And it was the Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, Senecas, and Tuscaroras who came in around the early 1700s and became the Six Nations. Prior to that, we were known as the Five Nations. After the Revolutionary War, there was a push to remove indigenous people west of the Mississippi. Our people began to explore that, and we sent out people out here to what was Fort Howard at that time, the Michigan Territory. And we met with the Menominees and the Ho-Chunks. There were a couple of treaties that were made during that time. And in 1822, one was agreed upon for joint use of territories with the Menominee Nation. And some of the estimates were from 5 to 8 million acres of that joint use. Many treaties were signed, and there was dispute as to the contents of those treaties by the Menominees as well as the Oneidas and the federal government, who were acting as liaisons between the two nations. The reservation was established in 1838 of 65,400 acres. What was allotted out at that time was 100 acres per individual. So there were 654 Oneidas here at that time. And as time goes on, there were different federal policies that were implemented to acculturate our people. And one of the things was the boarding schools. And Carlisle came to be in 1879. It was a number of years, though, that went by before our first group of children were forced to go to these boarding schools. Hampton University was another one. That was actually the very first school that our children went to. The next year is when they went to Carlisle. Hampton was a segregated school. There were still Black Native American children that were there, but it was segregated. These schools, though, were run by the Army. So they're very regiment. It was like a boot camp. And these kids were forced. They didn't have an option to say, no, we don't want our children to go. It was mandatory. And the area superintendent of the tribes or the nations in this area here would escort them down, by train. And they would stay there as young as 5 years old. At that time, they only went up to grade 8. They only spent half the day learning about the 3 R's, I guess they call it. And the other half of the day, they would be doing something in terms of upkeep of the school. It was a functioning farm. So they were forced to work out in the fields and do all that kind of stuff, the boys. And they would learn how to farm or how to be a blacksmith or how to be a carpenter, those kinds of things. And the girls were in the home, were in the buildings and learning how to make clothes and how to cook and how to clean. And when the school year was done, some would stay there and others would get farmed out into the area to different farms and even out east to different homes out there where they would be like servants. And then in the fall time, they would get back on trains and come back to the school. So they didn't come home. You think about what they had to endure, in terms of living in that type of environment, very authoritarian environment. There's stories that we have about the abuses that these children went through and the ones that died as well out there. That went on up until the Dawes Allotment Act came to be in 1879, I believe it was. The reservation up until that time was held communally. And what the Dawes Allotment Act did was it allotted out land into individuals. And there was a stipulation that after 25 years, it would be taxable. And this is a concept that was foreign to our people. It took a few years again for that to come down the pike, but it eventually got it allotted out. There was over 1,500 parcels of land that was allotted out, and 80 acres was set aside for boarding school. And that was in 1891 when they got it allotted out. And the next year is when they started construction of the boarding school. And in 1893 is when the boarding school opened up. Initially, the first superintendent of that school was very lenient in terms of allowing the children to go home on the weekends or for the parents to come and visit on the weekends. And then after a number of years of that, he left and another guy came in and shut everything down. They were forced to stay there throughout the school year. Maybe just during Christmas, they were allowed to go home. They wouldn't allow them to come and visit them. And so again, you think about, the trauma of that, again, being a very regimental, authoritarian environment for these young kids, not knowing, what love is and the care and having that mother and father figure there to help them. And the big thing about the boarding schools was the idea of acculturating our children and turning them into Americans. So they were forbidden from speaking their language.
And my father was about 20 years older than my mother. They both spoke the language, and they didn't teach 9 of us. Never learned the language. We'd hear them speaking it, but they didn't speak it to us specifically. We never learned it. What they wanted to do to our people is kill the Indian and save the man. And that's just what they did. Because now we have no speakers that knew it from a young age.
My mother and dad were native speakers, but my mother left home when she was about 4 years. 4 years when they used to go to the homes and they'd check see who all was in. And if the kids in their school age, they'd take them from boarding schools. So my dad always my mother used to hide my dad, so he didn't go till he was about 9 years old, I think. Finally found out he was there. His brother and sisters was all speak the language while they were in the school, but they would get caught, so they were punished all the time. So my dad seen that, and he said, "I'll never teach my kids the language," he said. And he kept his promise.
And there's a lot of stories that we have about their experiences with that and being punished, even isolated for a number of days for speaking their language. And they were also forced to take English names as well. And the big part there too was, again, the Christianization of our children as well. Even though we've been Christianized since the 1700s, this was the nail in the coffin of Christianizing our people. Any of our people practicing our ways, our traditional ways, was banned, was outlawed.
Our ways, those kind of ways, our medicines, our healers, they had to be, it kind of had to be secret.
And it was actually that way until 1979 with the Native American Religious Freedom Act. So it produced a lot of trauma in our kids. And so when they came back home, that's how they were, very regimental, very authoritarian, and they began to have children as well. And when you take an identity away from people, it kind of breaks their spirit. And this was where alcohol really took hold of our people. And so when you have that kind of environment, it's just a raging fire, and there's all the domestic abuse that goes with that. That becomes generational. By 1929, what the Dawes Allotment Act did was that by that time, 99% of the reservation was lost because our people didn't understand that taxation. And so when the value of the land equaled the amount of taxes that they owned, then people were being evicted. And we have stories about that too. Some of the first language speakers that I worked with, they remember that, being evicted from their land because they didn't pay their taxes. There was also provisions that were made to the Dawes Allotment Act that made it easier for them to sell their land, and they had to be deemed competent by a court. And before that 25-year period was up, they could sell that land. And so there was a lot of that was going on. People were taking loans out and mortgaging their land, not paying the loan back, and then losing their land. Really became displaced within our territory here. They created another program called the IRA, Indian Reorganization Act. And so what this does, it basically forced tribes to adopt a foreign governance.
We were struggling. And so the government stepped in and said they give Oneida 1,000 acres, but they had to accept the former government that they wanted us to have, what we have today. Of course, we were so dang poor back then, everybody was struggling. They accepted it.
Traditionally, we used our clans, the wolf, the turtle, and the bear. That was the foundation of our governance. There were 3 distinct families within each one of them. And from there, were our political and spiritual leaders. So we had our clan mothers, and they were responsible of ensuring that our spokespeople, what we call the chiefs, were carrying on their responsibilities. Over time, that eroded, and from the churches became leaders that we looked at as chiefs, but not our traditional chiefs. And they became those leaders that signed off on those treaties. So what the Indian Reorganization Act does is that it abolishes our clan system. And when we adopted it, it made us kind of a carbon copy of the US government. So we began to elect our people. In the traditional governance, those positions were intended to be for life. And there was checks and balances in there to ensure that those political and spiritual leaders were fulfilling their responsibilities. And so with that, though, there was some land that came back to the nation. The federal government purchased land. When our boarding school had closed, what the government did was they bought land within the reservation for the different school districts. The reservation was divided into the different school districts. It was divided into 2 counties, Brown and Outagamie County. And so the different school districts built these little schoolhouses all over the reservation. One for the Pulaski School District, for the Seymour, for Freedom, for West De Pere, and Green Bay as well. And all these little schoolhouses is where the children began to go to school. Talk about divide and conquer. Our reservation was so divided. For instance, when I went to school, I was in the Seymour School District. About a mile down the road was the West De Pere School District, where I had friends. And another half mile down the other way to the south of us was another line, and that was the Freedom School District. So we are all divided up. And so that's where our children began to go to school. When they closed them down, then they started busing us into the schools in Seymour, Freedom, and Pulaski, West De Pere, and Green Bay as well. We're losing our identity. The language is still there. My grandparents' generation, they were first language speakers, and there was a number of them that continued to speak the language when they returned from the boarding schools. But they didn't teach their children. Like my mom, she'll be 90. That generation, it was the first generation where English was the first language in our homes. In terms of our history, again, in the school systems, we weren't learning about that as well. When the 70s came around, there was a big surge in finding our roots. So we ended up going out east, out to Canada, where we had our longhouse and where ceremonies were being done. And we began to learn about those kind of things.
So we went to Holy Apostles Church, which is Episcopal Church in Oneida. I never really understood all of it. One day when I was older, which was probably in 1978 about, I went to a meeting and they had afterwards at the little white building on Chicago Corners, and they had some people from Canada there, and they had a social, and I thought, how come I never heard about this? Never, And so then I learned about culture, and it just really just became part of me. And I never went back to church there. And I just learned more about our culture and our traditions, and went to the Longhouse.
As time goes on, we are funding for our own school, our tribal school, and the emphasis was to teach the language and culture and history to our children. And so that's been there since I think in 1979 that started. In 1980, we built our longhouse. In 1982, we started having ceremonies here for the very first time. And initially, we needed to have help with our relatives from Canada because we didn't have speakers. Even though we had first language speakers, they didn't know all the procedures and the protocols and all the stories and songs and dances that go with each ceremony. And so a lot of us guys, we started learning our language, the ceremonial as well as the conversational Oneida. And eventually we came to the point where we didn't need their help anymore because we had speakers here that could carry on the ceremonies and singers and everything. And so that's what we've been doing ever since, bringing that back. And so there's been a big push to go immersion with our little ones, because that's where we need to start, and have dedicated families to be a part of that, to learn at the same time, to come to the point where the first language of our babies is going to be Oneida. And that's the ultimate goal, is to reverse all of that acculturation and put everything back into our children of our history, our culture, our language, our stories, to bring that pride back and to help them in today's society with all the distractions that are out there with the chemicals, alcoholism, and the opiates and all that, is to reinstill in our people that pride which was taken away. Our land is our identity, because when we say Oneida, when we say that word, it speaks to our land, our homelands, because it's a description of our homelands, where we spent thousands of years in that territory. And it has to do with these big boulders that are sticking out of the ground all over the place out there. And that's what we became known as, the people, the standing stone. And so when we remove ourselves from that, is almost kind of like taking a part of our spiritual connection to the land. And we had to reconnected here. They were so pleased with what the land was like here, because it reminded them of their home, of our homelands, how pristine it was here at that time. Because we're way out here, we're part of the Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, is that they refer to our community here as Dalokowantne. And so every community has a name in its language of all the 10 other longhouses out east in Canada, New York, and it describes their home. It's a description of their homeland, something significant about their territory. And so that was something that impressed our ancestors when they came here, was just how much waterfall was here. And that's something that's coming back today as well with all the land restoration that's been going on. One of the federal policies to acculturate our people and to Americanize them was to remove Native Americans from their territories. The Indian Removal Act was to remove all Native Americans west of the Mississippi River. At that time, that was all Indian territory. There was no settlements there. And what it was to open up that whole eastern part of the United States to settlers. There was such a big influx. Actually, during the Revolutionary War, that was one of the things that they had promised people who volunteered, was that they would get so much land. And so they had to, make all these treaties with Native Americans for land secessions in order to do that. And our family actually ended up in Dallas, Texas. And I was about 2 years old, and we went down there, and they got my dad a job, and they got us a place to stay. They helped with the rent and the travel expenses and the moving expenses, and even got furniture and stuff like that. And one of the stipulations of that was that you were not to return to your reservation. We weren't there that long, 6-9 months at the most, and then we ended up coming back here to Oneida. But a lot of Native peoples didn't return. And so you go to major metropolitan cities today, there's a large population of Native Americans of all different kinds of nations. You go to Chicago, Milwaukee, Minnesota, LA, Dallas, New York, all these big major cities, there's a large population of Native Americans. And that was a part of, again, Americanizing us and doing away with the Native American population, erasing that.
As colonized as we are, as we become, we're not fully colonized. And it isn't so easy for us to go to Green Bay and get this help, or even come in here and get this help.
Having that understanding of the history, I think, is key, because then there can be some compassion. I think a lot of our people don't really understand the history because it's never been told. In our history, there's nothing in there. Not much. And I didn't learn anything about this till I went to college. It just blew me away. It made me understand why we are the way we are, because of all the atrocities that we went through. You talk about all the wars that we've been through. Every war since the Civil War, our community has been a part of that. Every single one. We've had that alliance with the U.S., but we still suffered, just like all the Native Americans in the United States, Canada, all over the world, actually, as they suffered. For many years, our people, Native people, were proud, but because of the things that had went on in our histories, that they didn't know what they're really proud of. Once you learn your language, once you learn your history, once you learn your culture, your ceremonies, then you begin to understand what to be proud of. All those things, all those teachings, all those stories, everything, those are things that are applicable in today's society. And that's something that we can stand on as a foundation as we go forward. And the more we do that, the more we'll see a change in behavior. We have stories about that. Handsome Lake, what they call the Gully Wee, he was an alcoholic. He was a chief, he was a hereditary chief, and he was an alcoholic. And he turned his life around. He gave up that alcohol, and he began to talk about our ways and the effects of all the things that came across the ocean and how they have impacted our people and how we can move away from that. And it's through our culture is how we do that.